No one took her seriously, just a girl in a wheelchair who had come for a tour. But when she raised her hand and pointed to the buildings, everyone stopped talking. The architects laughed, the foreman scoffed, but what she said shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you watch this video from. The sky above the city was washed in muted shades of gray, not quite stormy, but far from sunny. It was the kind of day that felt like a pause, between seasons, between stories. In a quiet corner apartment on the 4th floor of a modest brick building, the windows were slightly fogged from the warmth inside. The living room was cluttered with models of bridges, towers, and unconventional roof lines, all carefully preserved despite a layer of dust. Blueprints lined the walls like framed portraits. Some were rolled and stacked in corners, others half unfurled across tables, pinned under coffee mugs and coasters. And at the center of it all, nestled amid the clutter, was Aaliyah James. 14 years old, dark-skinned, sharp-eyed, and seated in her custom-built wheelchair, Aaliyah didn't move with uncertainty. Her hands were always steady, even when her spine wasn't. She wasn't defined by the wheels beneath her, though the world insisted on trying. Her curiosity moved faster than any feet ever could, and she had the kind of mind that traced structural flaws the way musicians traced melodies, instinctively, mathematically, beautifully. She was tinkering with a miniature geodesic dome made of matchsticks and glue when her father shuffled into the room. Edward James, once one of the city's most sought-after architects, now walked with a cane in one hand and the weight of unspoken disappointment in the other. His limp had been the result of a minor stroke 2 years prior, but the true wound had come before that, when he'd been dismissed from his architectural firm under a cloud of corporate politics and veiled accusations. He never talked about it in detail, but Aaliyah remembered the evening he'd come home with his satchel, the rolled plans peeking out like bones from a broken frame, and his voice quiet in a way that didn't feel like calm. "Morning, Starshine," he muttered, placing a folded piece of mail on the corner of the dome she was working on. She looked up from her project and raised a brow. "You're quoting musicals now?" He smirked, that same half-smile he used to wear at city presentations before life turned on him. Only for the truly significant mornings. He nodded toward the envelope. "Read it." Aaliyah wiped her fingers clean on the hem of her sweater and opened the letter. Her eyes scanned it once, then again, more slowly. It was printed on glossy cardstock with an embossed seal and a digital QR code for verification. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of the Future Built Innovation Center. Witness the unveiling of the city's most advanced sustainable structure. Guest of honor, Architect Gregory Mann." She froze. "Future Built," she said. "Dad, isn't that—" He was already pouring himself coffee with trembling hands. "Yes, that's the building." The building. The one that had been his concept, his vision. Years ago, he had drawn the first renderings of a community-integrated hub that blended accessibility, sustainability, and aesthetic bravery. But the design had been hijacked, then stripped, then passed off to another team. His name had been erased from the final documents, his contribution reduced to a footnote in an internal memo. That building stood downtown now, his building without his name. "And Gregory Mann," she said, "didn't he—" Edward's jaw tightened. "He's the one who signed the order terminating my contract." Aaliyah's eyes flicked back to the invitation. "Why would they invite you?" "I assume it's meant to be some kind of token gesture. Damage control. They want to look gracious, to pretend the fallout never happened." He paused. "They probably don't expect me to show." Aaliyah set the letter down slowly, carefully, like it was something fragile. Then we should go. Edward shook his head. It's not our fight anymore. Let them have their glass and steel fantasy. I'm done with that world. She wheeled closer, eyes level with his. You may be done with it, but I'm not. His eyes softened. Ali? No. She cut him off gently. They took your vision. They twisted it. I want to see what they made of it. He sighed, but she could see the faint glimmer of agreement behind his weariness. After a moment, he nodded. All right, but we go as guests. No drama, no confrontations. Promise me. Aaliyah didn't answer with words. She just smiled and returned to her dome, her mind already sketching out how the day might unfold. They arrived the next morning just before 10. The city's downtown was buzzing with construction noise, traffic, and street vendors hawking novelty blueprints with the words, City of the Future, printed in bold metallic ink. The Future Built Innovation Center rose above the skyline like a glass phoenix, its edges sharp and its walls reflecting the surrounding buildings with an almost smug brilliance. It was beautiful, but something about it made Aaliyah's stomach twist. They entered through a towering arched entrance flanked by steel columns shaped like stylized tree trunks. A holographic welcome message danced in the air above them. Welcome to Future Built, it read in soft glowing script. Designing tomorrow, today. Edward's shoulders stiffened as they moved through the atrium. A cluster of men and women in sleek suits mingled near the center. A man with frosted temples and a glinting lapel pin was giving an interview to a local news crew. Gregory Mann. Still handsome in that artificially ageless way, still arrogant. Edward turned away before their eyes could meet. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice from their left. A young assistant in a branded blazer approached. "Mr. James, right? I have you and your guest registered. Right this way." He didn't say daughter or child, just guest. The way some people didn't say wheelchair but meant it anyway. Aaliyah said nothing. She was used to being overlooked. They were led through the building like tourists through a museum. First to the solar atrium, then the kinetic floor conference room, then to the suspended garden bridge. Everything shimmered. Everything gleamed. And yet, everything felt just a little hollow, like the architects had chased beauty without substance. Aaliyah noticed the potted greenery wasn't planted in real soil. The garden bridge was too narrow for two wheelchairs to pass simultaneously. The supposed universal access elevators had a floor plan that would trap users if more than two entered at once. She made mental notes. So many of them. As they reached the west wing, a glass-walled section that overlooked a multi-level gallery, she saw it. A sweeping ramp that connected the upper floors to the main hall below. It spiraled downward in a graceful arc, lined with what looked like brushed aluminum railings and embedded LED strips. It was the centerpiece of their inclusive design. It was also wrong. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew. Edward was distracted by a former colleague who waved him over with cautious friendliness. "Catch up with you in a minute?" he asked. She nodded. Alone, Aaliyah wheeled toward the ramp. Its surface gleamed underfoot, inviting and polished. Too polished. She placed one hand on the railing and gave it a soft shake. It wobbled. Then, cautiously, she rolled onto the incline. Halfway down, her wheels began to slip. She stopped herself, with a sharp pull on the rims, her hands instinctively angling to rebalance. The gradient was too steep. No grip, no texture, no traction. She backed up slowly, safely, and reached the top again. Her breath was shallow, her pulse rapid. A man in a crisp suit was watching her from a few feet away. "Everything all right?" he asked, tone neutral but eyes amused. She nodded tightly. "Bit of a learning curve, huh?" he added, gesturing at the ramp. "State-of-the-art stuff. Maybe not what you're used to." Her jaw clenched. "It's not safe," she said quietly. He smirked. "I think we've had more qualified people look it over." And just like that, he walked away. Aaliyah turned to face the ramp once more. The LED lights pulsed gently beneath the surface, their glow hiding imperfections. She squinted. There, barely visible, a faint crack in one of the lower panels. Almost cosmetic. Almost. Her fingers tightened on the rims of her chair. It wasn't about revenge, or pride, or showing off. It was about the quiet voice in her mind whispering, "Something's wrong." And no one is listening. Not yet. She wheeled herself back toward the main hall, her thoughts already assembling like steel beams, precise, aligned, and unyielding. The hum of admiration echoed through the west atrium of the future-built center as visitors murmured their approval at the sleek, minimalist elegance surrounding them. Glass and metal curved gracefully around soft, indirect lighting. The scent of fresh polymers and polished steel lingered in the air, mixing with floral notes from strategically placed artificial planters. Architects, investors, tech representatives, and politicians mingled beneath banners that read, "Tomorrow begins today." But Aaliyah sat silently, the soft whir of her wheelchair nearly drowned out by the polished acoustics of the space. She couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the ramp. The way the wheels of her chair had lost their grip, the angle that felt too sharp, the subtle wobble in the rail that the man had casually dismissed. Most people would have chalked it up to an uncomfortable moment, moved on, forgotten it. But Aaliyah's mind didn't forget. Her brain worked like her father's once did, like a load-bearing truss calculating pressure, weight, angles, and consequences without needing to verbalize it. Even as she followed her father down the corridor toward the solar wall where a group had gathered for the next segment of the tour, her mind remained on that ramp. She kept looking back. The sunlight, flooding through the glass facade, cast moving patterns across the floor as if the building itself were alive. But Aaliyah noticed how the lower edge of the ramp caught the light at a strange angle. It cast a slight distortion, like an edge too sharp to be safe. She looked around to see if anyone else had noticed. No one had. Her father was deep in quiet conversation with a man she vaguely recognized from an old photograph on his desk. Jorge Ruiz, once a junior architect on his team, now a sharply dressed executive with too much confidence and too little time. Aaliyah thought of interrupting, but stopped. Her father had made her promise not to stir trouble, not to make a scene. This wasn't her battle, he had said. But whose was it, if not hers? As the group moved toward the vertical garden exhibit, Aaliyah let herself fall behind. She turned her chair slowly and made her way back to the ramp. No one stopped her. Most attendees were still distracted by interactive displays and the champagne service stationed in the central courtyard. She wheeled up to the start of the incline, let her fingers rest gently on the push rims, and studied the structure more closely. The first problem was slope. It was only slightly over regulation, maybe by 2 or 3 degrees. But that small difference made all the difference when translated into strain on wheels and brake resistance, especially for users who had less strength than she did. If she'd been tired or distracted earlier, she could have easily lost control. The second problem was texture. The ramp's surface was smooth, too smooth. A glossy finish meant to match the aesthetic of the surrounding architecture, but it sacrificed functionality. There were no cross-grip strips, no rough treads, no anti-slip grooves. It looked like a runway, not a safe access way. And then there were the handrails. She gripped one again and gently pulled. The motion revealed the smallest give, no more than a few millimeters, but enough to be felt. She leaned in, peering at the joint where the railing met the floor. A bolt was slightly misaligned, not loose but off-center. It had probably passed visual inspection because it didn't visibly move unless stress-tested. But in an emergency, when someone really needed to rely on it, that bolt could mean disaster. She took out her phone and snapped several photos. One of the bolt, one of the incline, one of the whole ramp from the side. She opened a notes app and began recording observations. Just as she was about to move on, a pair of leather shoes stepped into her field of vision. "You again," came the voice. Aaliyah looked up to see the same man from earlier, the one who had smirked after she slipped. He wore a badge clipped to his breast pocket that read, "Adam Collins, Lead Architectural Supervisor." He gestured to the ramp. Still worried about the scary slope? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted her phone and showed him the photo of the misaligned bolt. "This is a code violation," she said, her voice calm. Adam blinked at the screen, then laughed. "You know, if I had a nickel for every civilian who thinks they found a code violation, I'd be running a firm in Dubai," he said. "You're Edward's daughter, right?" She nodded. "Explains it," he said, voice laced with derision. "You've been trained to see flaws that aren't there." Aaliyah stared at him, expression unreadable. "I appreciate the enthusiasm, kid," he went on, turning to walk away. "But these things were designed and approved by people who actually studied architecture." She opened her mouth to reply, but he was already gone. She sat there for a long time, staring at the ramp, not because she was unsure, but because she was calculating. At that moment, the crowd's chatter shifted. An announcement played over the PA system. "The guided tour will now continue to the Grand Glass Gallery. Please follow your hosts." Aaliyah's stomach tightened. The Grand Glass Gallery was the heart of the center, an elevated hall made entirely of reinforced panels and steel cable tension supports. A panoramic corridor suspended above the main floor, it was designed to host events, product launches, and even small concerts. She remembered the digital mock-ups from a city development pamphlet. And more importantly, she remembered the location of the fault line. From where she sat, she could see the gallery's lower supports running across the ceiling of the floor below. And now, looking with fresh eyes, she noticed something new. On the southernmost panel, right where a load-bearing anchor met the wall, there was a thin spiderweb crack in the surrounding plaster, barely visible. But it hadn't been there when she first passed by. Her breath caught. She approached the area as subtly as she could, wheeling herself beneath the gallery. The supporting struts were angled in a way that created shadows, but with her phone's flashlight she could see the crack more clearly now. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't cosmetic, it was stress. She ran a quick angle calculation based on the width of the upper hall and the placement of the supports. Then she tapped into her building simulation app and entered rough values, estimated loads, materials, span distance. The result gave her pause. The tension on the gallery was too high for the structure's design. At full occupancy, say during a tour group, there was a high likelihood of torsion-induced failure. Not total collapse, perhaps, but enough to crack the panels or cause a chain reaction. And right now, a tour group was headed in. She spun around and wheeled herself back toward the atrium. She spotted her father, still speaking with Jorge Ruiz. now joined by a younger woman who looked like a junior associate. "Dad," she said as she approached, urgency in her voice. Edward turned, immediately sensing the tension. "I need you to listen to me. The gallery, the tension supports are under too much stress. There's already structural fatigue forming on the plaster. If they walk in there with a full group—" He raised a hand gently. "Aaliyah." "I'm serious," she insisted. Hor gave a small chuckle. "Is everything all right?" "She thinks the structure's unsound," Edward said quietly, not mocking, but not confirming. Jorge turned to her. "I'm sure the engineering team took everything into account." "They didn't," she snapped. "Or they altered the materials." He raised a brow. "That's a heavy accusation." "I have proof," she said, showing her screen. Jorge glanced at it, then gave a tight smile. "I'm afraid this isn't the place for an amateur inspection, young lady." The woman next to him offered a sympathetic smile, as if indulging a child. Aaliyah looked at her father. "If I'm wrong, then I'll leave quietly. But if I'm right—" Edward looked torn, but the weight of years of disappointment hung behind his eyes. He didn't answer. A group of people began filing into the glass gallery. She stared up at them, heart pounding. The floor beneath them groaned faintly, inaudible to most, but not to her. They were walking into danger, and no one would stop them. Not yet. The sound was faint, like the creak of a floorboard in an empty house, or the gentle strain of wood bending under weight. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. The laughter of the tour group, the murmur of conversation, and the quiet swell of background music masked the warning. But Aaliyah heard it. She heard everything. Sitting beneath the grand glass gallery, angled just enough to see the undersides of its supports, she noticed the delicate shift of tension, the unnatural way light refracted across the beams, the subtle vibration of the steel mounts as the crowd above moved in unison across the glass panels. She didn't breathe. Upstairs, through the slanted glass panels, she saw silhouettes. About 20 people had entered so far. Guests, investors, staff, journalists. Many were clustered around an interactive map projected against one wall. Others peered out through the transparent floor at the lower atrium, pointing at architectural features and posing for photographs. The weight distribution was uneven. People naturally gathered near edges, not the center. That was the problem. The cables above her head vibrated with a rhythm not aligned with the design's intention. They weren't snapping, not yet, but they were straining. She rolled backward from beneath the gallery, her eyes darting around for someone, anyone, who would listen. But all she saw were polished shoes and detached smiles. No one was looking down. The surface-level beauty of the building masked its rot. She'd suspected it from the moment she crossed the threshold. There was a slickness to it all, a sense that it had been made to impress, not endure. It was a showroom with scaffolding, a mask made of glass and steel. And now, as the weight of real people bore down on its flaws, the truth was beginning to emerge. She needed help. She spun her chair around and moved quickly, well, as quickly as the space and the people allowed, back toward the central atrium, where a security kiosk stood near the entrance. A man in a navy blazer was speaking into an earpiece, occasionally glancing toward the grand staircase. "Excuse me," Aaliyah said, pulling up near the desk. He gave her a cursory glance. "Guests should remain with the tour group." "I'm not a tourist," she said. "There's a structural problem in the gallery. It's urgent." He blinked, his smile frozen in professional neutrality. "If you're concerned about accessibility, we have a feedback form online." "No," she said sharply. "The load tension is wrong. The gallery might give way." He frowned. "I'm sorry. Are you with the engineering team?" She opened her mouth, then shut it again. She didn't have a badge. She didn't have a license. She didn't even have an adult standing next to her. Just her chair, and a phone full of calculations no one would look at. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she tried again. "You'll need to wait," the man said. "There's a schedule." She turned away, trembling with frustration. Around her, the event continued as if nothing were wrong. Digital banners flashed slogans above the main stairwell. Live feeds displayed from the gallery showing smiling guests tapping on glass panels to explore floor plans. She stared up at one of the screens. In the top right corner, she saw a man step near the outer beam, close to the zone she had identified earlier in her model. He leaned casually against a wall, laughing. The light near his feet shifted. The glass curved, only slightly, but enough for her to know it wasn't her imagination. She turned again. Her father had rejoined the main crowd and was quietly speaking to someone from his past. She wheeled toward him with urgency. "Dad," she said, louder than before. He turned, startled by her tone. "Allie, what?" "I need you to back me up. The gallery isn't safe. There are stress cracks in the plaster under the main anchor. If more weight builds up, it's going to fail." He blinked, caught between concern and disbelief. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took out her phone and showed him the simulation. The numbers, the angles, the red warning band flashing across the load curve. "I ran it 4 times, she said, "even using conservative estimates. It's under-designed." He studied the data, then looked at her face, then up at the gallery. Finally, he nodded. Together, they approached the nearest staff member in a Future Built badge, a young woman with a tablet and a headset. "Ma'am," Edward said, clearing his throat, "there's a serious structural issue in the gallery. My daughter has a load simulation. We'd like you to evacuate the space immediately." The woman blinked, then smiled. "Sir, the gallery was cleared by 2 engineering firms and passed final inspection 2 weeks ago. I assure you—" "You're not listening," Aaliyah interrupted. "There's a microfracture under the southernmost anchor. If you don't clear the gallery, you're going to have a situation." "I understand your concern," the woman said with that same glazed patience, "but the building is fully certified. Perhaps, if you'd like to speak to someone from operations—" "Get your head engineer," Aaliyah snapped. "Now." The woman's lips thinned. She stepped aside and spoke into her headset. "Code 7, possible issue in gallery. Can we get an engineer on standby?" A moment later, a man approached. Late 40s, square build, light goatee. He wore a Future Built jacket and carried a clipboard. "What seems to be the trouble?" Edward gestured to Aaliyah. "My daughter's an analyst in training. She's identified an issue with the gallery's stress loads. She thinks it's dangerous." The man looked down at Aaliyah, bemused. "How old are you?" "Old enough to know your anchor bolts are misaligned and your stress tolerances are off by 15%. He stared. She showed him the screen, the simulation, the crack photos. He scowled. "Where did you get the beam specs?" "They're in the public planning documents," she said, "filed last month. I matched them to what I observed on site. The panel anchoring doesn't match the spec." "Let me see that photo again," he said, now more serious. She handed him the phone. He zoomed in. His brow furrowed. "I want to check the subfloor," he said. He turned and spoke into his radio. "This is Howard. Pause all foot traffic in Gallery 1. I'm heading under the base support." The announcement came within moments. A polite chime rang out, followed by a voice instructing guests to remain still for a brief maintenance check. Upstairs, movement slowed. Howard walked briskly across the main atrium and disappeared through a maintenance door. Aaliyah followed at a distance. Her father stayed behind, speaking with the staff, now beginning to ask questions. Inside the maintenance corridor, it was dim and cold. Howard crouched near the base of the southern anchor, flashlight in hand. Aaliyah rolled closer and watched him study the joint. He tapped it, then ran his fingers along the plaster. Then he swore. The crack had deepened. "This wasn't here yesterday," he muttered. "It wasn't meant to last," Aaliyah said softly. "The load's too high, it's flexing." Howard straightened. His face was pale. He tapped his headset. "Immediate evacuation of Gallery 1, he said. "Repeat, evacuate now." Back in the atrium, a siren chirped twice. The voice returned. "If you're concerned about accessibility, we have a feedback form online." "No," she said sharply. "The load tension is wrong. The gallery might give way." He frowned. "I'm sorry. Are you with the engineering team?" She opened her mouth, then shut it again. She didn't have a badge. She didn't have a license. She didn't even have an adult standing next to her. Just her chair, and a phone full of calculations no one would look at. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she tried again. "You'll need to wait," the man said. "There's a schedule." She turned away, trembling with frustration. Around her, the event continued as if nothing were wrong. Digital banners flashed slogans above the main stairwell. Live feeds displayed from the gallery showing smiling guests tapping on glass panels to explore floor plans. She stared up at one of the screens. In the top right corner, she saw a man step near the outer beam, close to the zone she had identified earlier in her model. He leaned casually against a wall, laughing. The light near his feet shifted. The glass curved, only slightly, but enough for her to know it wasn't her imagination. She turned again. Her father had rejoined the main crowd and was quietly speaking to someone from his past. She wheeled toward him with urgency. "Dad," she said, louder than before. He turned, startled by her tone. "Allie, what?" "I need you to back me up. The gallery isn't safe. There are stress cracks in the plaster under the main anchor. If more weight builds up, it's going to fail." He blinked, caught between concern and disbelief. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took out her phone and showed him the simulation. The numbers, the angles, the red warning band flashing across the load curve. "I ran it 4 times, she said, "even using conservative estimates. It's under-designed." He studied the data, then looked at her face, then up at the gallery. Finally, he nodded. Together, they approached the nearest staff member in a future-built badge, a young woman with a tablet and a headset. "Ma'am," Edward said, clearing his throat, "there's a serious structural issue in the gallery. My daughter has a load simulation. We'd like you to evacuate the space immediately." The woman blinked, then smiled. "Sir, the gallery was cleared by 2 engineering firms and passed final inspection 2 weeks ago. I assure you—" "You're not listening," Aaliyah interrupted. "There's a microfracture under the southernmost anchor. If you don't clear the gallery, you're going to have a situation." "I understand your concern," the woman said with that same glazed patience, "but the building is fully certified. Perhaps, if you'd like to speak to someone from operations—" "Get your head engineer," Aaliyah snapped. "Now." The woman's lips thinned. She stepped aside and spoke into her headset. "Code 7, possible issue in gallery. Can we get an engineer on standby?" A moment later, a man approached. Late 40s, square build, light goatee. He wore a future-built jacket and carried a clipboard. "What seems to be the trouble?" Edward gestured to Aaliyah. "My daughter's an analyst in training. She's identified an issue with the gallery's stress loads. She thinks it's dangerous." The man looked down at Aaliyah, bemused. "How old are you?" "Old enough to know your anchor bolts are misaligned and your stress tolerances are off by 15%. He stared. She showed him the screen, the simulation, the crack photos. He scowled. "Where did you get the beam specs?" "They're in the public planning documents," she said, "filed last month. I matched them to what I observed on site. The panel anchoring doesn't match the spec." "Let me see that photo again," he said, now more serious. She handed him the phone. He zoomed in. His brow furrowed. "I want to check the subfloor," he said. He turned and spoke into his radio. "This is Howard. Pause all foot traffic in Gallery 1. I'm heading under the base support." The announcement came within moments. A polite chime rang out, followed by a voice instructing guests to remain still for a brief maintenance check. Upstairs, movement slowed. Howard walked briskly across the main atrium and disappeared through a maintenance door. Aaliyah followed at a distance. Her father stayed behind, speaking with the staff, now beginning to ask questions. Inside the maintenance corridor, it was dim and cold. Howard crouched near the base of the southern anchor, flashlight in hand. Aaliyah rolled closer and watched him study the joint. He tapped it, then ran his fingers along the plaster. Then he swore. The crack had deepened. "This wasn't here yesterday," he muttered. "It wasn't meant to last," Aaliyah said softly. "The load's too high, it's flexing." Howard straightened. His face was pale. He tapped his headset. "Immediate evacuation of Gallery 1, he said. "Repeat, evacuate now." Back in the atrium, a siren chirped twice. The voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are temporarily closing the Grand Glass Gallery for safety inspection. Please proceed to the central lounge." Above, the silhouettes shifted again. The guests began filtering out. Some grumbled, others took selfies. No one understood what had almost happened. Aaliyah exhaled. Her hands were shaking. Howard turned back to her. "You just caught what could have been a disaster," he said. "Someone designed it wrong," she replied. He hesitated. "No, someone changed it after the design phase. These aren't the materials from the blueprints. I oversaw the initial install. This is a downgrade." Her eyes narrowed. "Then someone covered it up." He didn't answer. She wheeled herself back into the atrium. The mood had shifted. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Staff rushed to and fro. Edward met her halfway. "What did he say?" "That I was right." Her father looked both proud and afraid. "They're going to want answers." "So do I," she replied. A few minutes later, another staff member approached, older, more senior-looking. He introduced himself as Douglas Crane, Deputy Operations Manager. "I understand you were the one who flagged the structural issue?" he asked. "Yes." "Would you be willing to share your findings?" "I already did." He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "We'll need to report this. But before we escalate, perhaps we can review things privately, in a conference room." Aaliyah stared at him. "You're trying to contain it." "I'm trying to prevent panic," he said. "You understand?" "No," she said. "I really don't." She turned to her father. "We're going home." Douglas blinked. "You're leaving?" "We've done our part," Edward said. "Now it's your turn." They exited the building under a sky that had gone darker since morning. Somewhere behind them, professionals were scrambling to explain how a teenager in a wheelchair had saved their gallery from collapse. But Aaliyah wasn't interested in vindication. Not yet. She had questions about the materials, the shortcuts, the altered specs, and she would find the answers, even if no one wanted her to. The sky over the city darkened as the evening settled in, casting long shadows across the sidewalks and the faded paint of the buildings outside Aaliyah's apartment window. Rain threatened at the edge of the horizon, thick clouds rolling in slow, deliberate waves. In the quiet of her bedroom, the dull hum of her laptop was the only sound aside from the occasional murmur of traffic several stories below. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with precision, not in haste, but with the steady mechanical rhythm of certainty. She wasn't playing games anymore. She was building a case. The screen in front of her displayed the floor plan of the future built center, multiple versions of it stacked and layered like geological strata. At the base was the original concept, a draft her father had shown her years ago, full of ambitious detail and integrated supports. It had been the kind of plan that defied skepticism, structurally bold but grounded in hard engineering, a center for people, not profit. The vision had stayed in her mind even after his name had been stripped from the credits. Overlaying that original plan was the approved blueprint from the city archives, the public-facing version submitted for permits and inspection. That plan was simpler, more conservative. Some of the original materials had been downgraded, a few decorative elements removed, but the structural core remained intact. Safe, sound, legal. But the last layer, the building as it stood now, was neither. Aaliyah had scanned the updated internal layout during her visit, piecing together the physical changes she'd observed with data pulled from QR codes affixed to beams and support panels. Using a combination of augmented reality tools and digital modeling software she had taught herself to use over the past 2 years, she created a reconstruction. And what it showed was chilling. Supports removed, anchors rerouted, glass thickness reduced, reinforcement beams substituted with lighter, cheaper alloys. There were just enough modifications to keep the illusion intact, but any architect worth their license would have seen it instantly. Someone had gambled structural integrity for visual flair, and worse, they had buried the evidence under layers of bureaucratic compliance. "Come see this," she called softly. Her father entered the room slowly, rubbing at the back of his neck. He looked more tired than usual, his shoulders slightly slumped from the weight of the day. But there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Not quite defeat. Not yet. She turned the screen toward him. "This is the gallery," she said. "This was your design." He nodded, then narrowed his eyes. "What's this red overlay?" "That's the weight distribution under the current build. After they changed the southern anchor, it unbalanced the whole load path." His jaw tightened. "And these cross beams?" she asked, zooming in. "Look at the metal spec." He bent down to read the serial number embedded in the corner of a scanned label. "Aluminum composite. That's not even grade 4. "Nope," she said, "and it's not what was approved either. They replaced it after inspection. Quietly. Probably after the city signed off." He let out a slow breath. This wasn't incompetence. "No," she said, "it was deliberate." He straightened, stepping back from the desk. "How far does this go?" "I don't know yet, but I have a feeling it's not just a gallery." She opened a new folder and began scrolling through the photos she had taken, close-ups of beams, panels, connectors, labels, bolts. She was building a library of discrepancies. Every time-stamped photo, every code scan, every inconsistent label told a story. "I matched every one of these to the public specs," she said, "and at least 8 components don't match the city filings." He sank into the chair beside her. "They cut corners," she went on, "but not to save money. They were still within budget. This wasn't about cash, it was about timeline. I think they rushed it. Someone forced the build to finish early." He closed his eyes. "And falsified the documents to make it look clean." She nodded. "And they got away with it. Until today." A moment of silence settled between them. "I was wrong," he said finally. She turned to him. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I kept my head down, they'd let us move on. But silence doesn't fix anything. You were right to speak up." She didn't smile. There was no victory in being right about something like this, just the weight of responsibility. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So what now?" "I think I know who can help." She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts. At the bottom of the list was a name she hadn't called in over a year. Max Taylor. He was a journalist, her father's old friend, someone who had once written a scathing piece about urban development fraud before being buried in legal threats and quietly pushed into obscurity. He had always believed in accountability, and he had never stopped paying attention. The phone rang twice before his voice answered, rough but alert. "Hello? Mr. Taylor," she said. "It's Aaliyah, Edward James's daughter." There was a pause. "I remember," he said. "You all right?" "I have something," she said, "something big." She didn't need to say more. He knew the weight behind her words. Within an hour, he was at their apartment, seated across from them with a notebook and a portable recorder. Aaliyah walked him through everything, what she saw, what she documented, what the software showed. Her father added context, names, past disagreements, memos he still had saved from years ago. Taylor's expression grew darker with every page. "They buried this," he said. "Not just the design changes. The inspections were signed by someone no longer with the firm. You're telling me the person who approved the last safety check doesn't even work there anymore?" Edward nodded grimly. "He was pushed out 2 months ago. No reason given." "They replaced a licensed inspector with a ghost," Taylor said, standing to pace the room. "And now they're having photo ops under a ceiling that could have crushed 20 people." He stopped, looked at them both. "This is a story, a real one." Aaliyah didn't answer. "I'll run it," he said, "but I need permission to use your names." Edward hesitated. Aaliyah didn't. "Do it," she said. Taylor left just after midnight. By morning, the article was live. It ran with the headline, "Cracks in the Future: How One Girl Exposed a Modern Disaster Waiting to Happen." The photo at the top was of the gallery's understructure, with her annotated arrows and calculations in clear focus. Her name was in the byline, right under Max's. She had insisted on that. It was her voice, after all. Within hours, the article exploded. Social media caught fire. A trending hashtag spread with astonishing speed. People began sharing videos from the opening, photos of the gallery, interviews of guests who had been present. Some were shocked, others were furious, but everyone was watching. By late afternoon, the city's engineering commission released a statement. "We are aware of the report regarding structural discrepancies at the Future Built Center. An investigation is now underway." Future Built, meanwhile, released their own message, terse and deflective. "We take all safety concerns seriously and are cooperating fully with city officials. Our commitment to innovation and inclusivity remains unchanged." Aaliyah watched the news unfold from the couch, her laptop in her lap, and her father beside her. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. That night, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with a letter, unmarked, hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Cease and desist, signed by the legal firm representing FutureBuilt. Her father cursed under his breath, crumpling the letter. They think they can scare us. She stared at the folded paper, then at the laptop. She opened her email and composed a message to Taylor. Let's keep going. Because this wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about the system that let it stand. By the time morning broke over the city, the story had spread like wildfire. The glow of dawn filtered through smogged clouds, casting a weak, diffuse light over the skyline. Down on the street, buses rumbled past with sleepy passengers, unaware that the front pages of every major news site were ablaze with the same headline. The media hadn't just picked up Max Taylor's article, they had amplified it, dissected it, translated it. Talk show hosts referenced it by name. Pundits debated it. Architecture students passed the link between themselves like contraband. The story had become a symbol. In the apartment, Aaliyah sat in her wheelchair, bleary-eyed but wide awake, her phone buzzing with a frequency she had never known. Messages flooded in from strangers. Some thanked her. Some asked for interviews. A few were cruel, but most were stunned. Stunned that a teenage girl, seated in silence in the corner of a building meant to celebrate progress, had seen what dozens of professionals had missed, or worse, ignored. Her father stood by the window, sipping coffee, watching the muted city with the sort of quiet dread that comes not from shock, but from recognition. He had known something like this was possible. For years he had suspected it, and for years he had stayed silent. They're going to come after us harder now, he said without turning. Aaliyah didn't answer. She was reviewing the new documents Taylor had sent overnight. Copies of subcontractor agreements, memos between project managers, emails between the firm's partners. He'd found someone inside FutureBuilt who had started to talk. The whistleblower hadn't revealed their identity yet, but the information was credible, detailed, damning. Someone had pushed for the project to finish 3 months ahead of schedule. Someone had signed off on the use of cheaper materials after inspections were complete. And someone had ordered the destruction of old reports that showed the original design parameters. The fingerprints weren't clear yet, but the trail had begun to appear. At 10:14 a.m., the knock came. They were expecting it, in a way, but that didn't stop Aaliyah's heart from skipping a beat. Her father answered the door. A tall man in a gray suit stood outside, accompanied by a woman holding a leather case. "Mr. James?" the man asked. "I'm Nicholas Grayson, legal counsel for FutureBuilt. This is my associate, Miss Lerner. May we come in?" Edward didn't move. "This is about the letter." Grayson smiled, as though this were all a routine misunderstanding. "We'd prefer to discuss this in person, to avoid any escalation." "We're not retracting anything," Edward said. "We're not asking for a retraction," Lerner said quickly. "We're asking for discretion." Grayson stepped forward. "Mr. James, Miss James, let me be clear. Your story has caused significant reputational damage. Our client is not interested in dragging this into court, but if forced to do so, they will pursue full legal remedies. However, we're prepared to make a counteroffer, a settlement, a non-disclosure agreement, compensation. You step away, and this ends now." Edward crossed his arms. Aaliyah stared at them, her voice cold. "How many people could have died if I hadn't spoken up?" Grayson's smile faltered. With all due respect, you're not qualified to—" "No," she said, "I'm not licensed. But I was right." He hesitated. "There's more at stake here than one structure. There are contracts, partnerships, entire divisions. What you're doing, it's dangerous. Not just for us, for yourselves." Her father took a step forward, standing between them. "This conversation is over." The door closed. An hour later, the calls began. The first was from a local radio station asking for an exclusive interview. Then came a producer from a major news channel. Then someone claiming to represent an architecture think tank. They all wanted Aaliyah. Some were genuine. Others were transparent in their motives. But each call made one thing clear. She was no longer invisible. By early afternoon, they returned to the Future Built Center, not as guests, not as silent observers, but as witnesses. The city had ordered a temporary closure of the Grand Glass Gallery. A mesh of yellow-black tape now cordoned off the area, while a group of inspectors in hard hats moved across the site like ants dissecting a carcass. Journalists waited at a distance, cameras ready, whispering to each other as Aaliyah and Edward passed through the entrance. The mood inside the building had changed. It was no longer celebratory. It was tense. Architects in suits walked briskly from room to room, heads low, avoiding eye contact. Event banners had been pulled down. Screens were dark. The words "innovation" in every detail had been removed from the digital wall. But not everyone was quiet. From the far end of the atrium, Adam Collins approached. He looked disheveled. Dark circles under his eyes. Jacket unbuttoned. He carried a folder in one hand. "Well," he said, stopping a few feet away, "you got what you wanted." Aaliyah tilted her head. "What exactly do you think I wanted?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Attention, validation, maybe your father's old job back." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think this is about?" Adam shrugged. "You were always a problem, James. You asked too many questions, pushed too hard." "And you didn't push hard enough," Aaliyah said. "You looked the other way." "I was doing my job." "You were protecting yourself," she said, "and now people know." He opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of the same photos she had shared online, her simulations, her annotations. "Do you know what this did to our firm?" he asked. "I'm not sorry," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head and walked away. Behind him, the inspectors had finished with the gallery and were now scanning beams in the eastern wing. One of them, a tall woman with a tablet and a hard hat, glanced toward Aaliyah, nodded once, and returned to work. Max Taylor met them in the lower lounge, where a makeshift press area had been set up. "They're going to declare the gallery structurally unsound," he said without preamble. 3 more fractures found under stress testing. The city's launching a formal review. And there's more. He handed Edward a file. Inside were copies of internal emails from the whistleblower. Aaliyah read them silently. "They knew," she said, "they knew the materials were substandard." "And they signed off anyway," Taylor said. "What now?" Edward asked. "We publish everything," Taylor said. "We go public again, this time with names." That evening, the second article went live. Buried beneath glass, the secret deals behind the Future Built scandal. It was longer than the first, angrier. It named senior engineers. It named directors. It showed how the budget had been manipulated, how safety reports had been rewritten, how signatures had been forged. And it named Adam Collins. In the hours that followed, the firm's website was taken offline. Several senior staff members resigned. The city council scheduled an emergency hearing, and the state engineering board launched an independent inquiry. Inside the apartment, Aaliyah sat quietly, watching the fallout unfold in real time. Her father sat beside her. "You did this," he said softly. She didn't smile. "They're not done," she said. "They'll try to survive this." "But now they have to do it in the light," he said. She nodded. Outside, the rain finally began to fall. It washed over the city in heavy sheets, running in rivers along the streets, over glass facades and concrete walkways. The kind of rain that scrubbed the surface of things, though not always deep enough to reach the rot beneath. But sometimes, Aaliyah thought, the first crack was all it took, and she had made the first one. The days that followed were unlike anything Aaliyah had ever lived through. It was as if the very fabric of her world had shifted, like someone had pulled back the curtain on the neat illusions people told themselves just to keep functioning. She had grown up watching her father struggle against silent barriers, unspoken rules, quiet exclusions, the way his name was always last in the credits or left off entirely. But now, she wasn't just watching. She was in the center of it, and the silence was gone. In its place was noise, media frenzy, legal posturing, cautious praise, buried fury. The city council had opened a formal investigation. Inspectors had sealed off large portions of the future-built center. Engineers brought in from out of state confirmed the structural failings and echoed her original findings, often in more complicated language but with the same essential truth. The gallery was flawed. The materials were wrong. The alterations had been unauthorized, and behind it all there were decisions. Someone, somewhere, had signed the orders that led to it. But as the light grew brighter, so did the shadows. On the fourth morning after the second article was published, Aaliyah awoke to the sound of a loud knock at the door. Her father was already halfway down the hall when she wheeled into the living room, still in her sleep shirt, hair mussed from the pillow. The man outside wore a delivery uniform, but he had no package, just a clipboard and a tightly folded envelope. "For Miss Aaliyah James," he said flatly. "Signature required." Edward signed without question, and the man turned and left without another word. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. Cease and desist again. This time the tone was different, harsher. The document accused Aaliyah of deliberate interference in an ongoing commercial enterprise, of unauthorized access to proprietary systems, and of public defamation of credentialed professionals. The letter was longer, angrier, and ended with the threat of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit should she, or Max Taylor, continue to publish unverified accusations. Her father's face grew tight as he read, his mouth a thin line. Aaliyah felt the familiar rise of heat in her chest, but it wasn't fear, it was insult. They were trying to intimidate her again, and this time they were doing it louder. She picked up her phone and called Max. He answered on the second ring. "They sent another one," she said. "I figured they would," he replied. "Mine came half an hour ago. It's the same tactic. Lawyers on retainer threatening everything short of exile." What do? We get louder. By noon, Taylor had written his third article, shorter, sharper, a direct response. It reprinted the cease and desist in full and deconstructed it line by line, ending with a single sentence. "If this is what the truth costs, we'll keep paying." Aaliyah's name was bolded at the top. She hadn't asked him to include her again. She didn't need to. He understood. The backlash was immediate. Some praised the defiance. Others accused them of grandstanding. A handful of powerful voices in the architectural community began to circle their wagons, publishing think pieces about the dangers of amateur interference and mob-fueled trial by media. Anonymous online accounts began to flood Aaliyah's inbox with insults, threats, and images she didn't want to see. One message read only, "You made enemies you can't see." But even those threats didn't shake her like the fourth message did. It arrived through her school email, an address she rarely used. It was simple, no subject line, no sender, just one sentence in the body of the message. "You don't know what you've started." She stared at the screen, the cursor blinking under the sentence like a countdown. Her hands trembled for the first time since this began. She closed the email, but didn't delete it. Instead, she forwarded it to Taylor and then opened a new document on her tablet. She began compiling every detail she could remember: names, dates, interactions, floor plans, scan data. If something happened to her, she wanted people to know everything. That evening, they received another visitor. Not a lawyer, not a courier. A man in his 60s, tall and heavy-set, with thinning gray hair and a soft-spoken voice. He introduced himself as Samuel Darrow, former city inspector. "I read the article," he said. "Your girl, she found it, the thing we all missed." He carried a thin briefcase and a face full of regrets. He had worked on the FutureBuilt project in the early phase, but had resigned before final approvals. "Too many shortcuts," he said. "I didn't want to be the guy who signed the paperwork when things went wrong." He handed them a folder. Inside were internal memos from the early design phase. Darrow's own notes flagged inconsistencies, material substitutions, and conversations that hinted at backroom deals. He hadn't saved everything, he said, just enough to ease his conscience if the worst ever happened. Aaliyah scanned the papers. She saw familiar names: Adam Collins, Gregory Mann, Nicholas Grayson, but also new ones. Individuals with titles like logistics coordinator and budget analyst. People who didn't appear in public press releases but had real authority behind the scenes. "You said you missed it," she told Darrow. He shook his head slowly. "No, I saw it. I just didn't know how to stop it." "But I'm just a girl," she said, more to herself than to him. He smiled without humor. "That's why they didn't see you coming." The next day, the city's oversight committee requested Aaliyah's presence at a private hearing. Her father tried to protest. She was 14, he reminded them. She wasn't an employee or a contractor. But they insisted. She had become a primary witness. The hearing took place in a beige conference room on the 12th floor of a government building. The walls were lined with framed photos of bridges and roadways, a quiet homage to civic engineering. The committee sat behind a long table. 3 men and 2 women, all in suits, all holding folders. Aaliyah wheeled herself to the designated space and waited. Her father sat beside her, silent but vigilant. They asked her to recount the events again, what she saw, what she documented, what tools she used. She answered everything calmly, clearly, without embellishment. One man leaned forward. "How did you learn to run those simulations?" She met his gaze. "I wanted to understand how things work. My dad taught me the basics. I learned the rest myself." One woman frowned. "Why didn't you bring this to someone sooner?" "I tried," she said. "They laughed." The room fell silent for a beat. Another committee member tapped his pen. "Do you believe this was an isolated failure or a pattern?" She hesitated, then said, "I think it's a culture." The woman nodded slowly. They dismissed her 20 minutes later. As she rolled out of the room, the hallway felt cavernous. She didn't know what they would do with her testimony, maybe nothing, maybe everything. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars honked, phones rang, elevators dinged, but something was shifting beneath the surface. That evening, a formal notice arrived at the FutureBuilt headquarters. The state regulatory board had ordered a full audit. Their operating license would be suspended pending investigation. The next morning, Aaliyah received a message from the whistleblower. It was just one word: thank you. But for her, it was everything. Because now she knew this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of reckoning. The city awoke to headlines that no longer asked if something had gone wrong, but instead how it had gone so long unnoticed. Every local paper, every national site with even a passing interest in infrastructure or corruption now carried versions of the same story. The audit, ordered by the State Regulatory Board, had begun in earnest. Its preliminary findings, leaked within 48 hours, confirmed much of what Aaliyah had exposed. Materials had been downgraded without proper documentation. Inspections had been bypassed or falsified. Internal communications pointed toward decisions made not for safety or design, but for speed and optics. The FutureBuilt Center, hailed as a marvel of modern architecture, now sat under an ever-deepening shadow. Inside the building, workers in city-issued uniforms stripped banners from the atrium and wheeled away high-end touchscreen displays. Construction tape wrapped around the grand glass gallery like crime scene ribbon. Rooms that had once been filled with light and applause now echoed with the silence of halted ambition. FutureBuilt's leadership had gone underground. Gregory Mann had not made a public appearance in over a week. Adam Collins had resigned, issuing a short defiant statement through his attorney. Nicholas Grayson, the firm's lawyer, had gone silent after the whistleblower's documents revealed he had advised upper management to contain reputational risk through targeted discreditation. The phrase had become infamous overnight. Aaliyah sat in her room with the window open, the breeze lifting the edges of papers scattered across her desk. It had been exactly 12 days since she had first rolled onto the ramp at FutureBuilt and felt her chair begin to slip. 12 days since she'd raised her voice in a room full of people who told her to be quiet. 12 days since the laughter. Now the tone had shifted entirely. She had just finished another phone interview, this one with a publication focused on ethics in engineering, when her father stepped into the room holding a heavy envelope. "This came by certified mail," he said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully. Inside was a formal commendation from the Department of Civil Oversight. A letter of acknowledgement, praising her exceptional attention to detail, personal courage, and profound contribution to public safety. It was printed on heavy paper with an embossed seal. There was also a note enclosed, handwritten, and brief. "You reminded us of what we forgot, that integrity doesn't come from credentials. It comes from action." She set it down beside her laptop and looked at her father. "What do we do now?" she asked. He smiled. "Anything you want." Later that afternoon, they were invited to attend a public city forum hosted at the Municipal Convention Hall. The mayor would be present, along with members of the city council, building commission, and a selection of community representatives. It was open to the public, and while no formal agenda was listed, it was clear what the event was for. It wasn't about policy. It was about facing what had been broken. When Aaliyah and her father arrived, they were met with a level of attention that felt unreal. People parted as they entered. Some clapped quietly, others simply nodded. A few asked to shake her hand. Cameras were everywhere, but Aaliyah barely noticed them. Her eyes were drawn instead to the stage, where a single empty chair waited, placed slightly apart from the long table of officials. A woman with a calm voice introduced the forum. She spoke about transparency, accountability, lessons learned. She cited failures and oversight, systemic pressures, and the courage of individuals who spoke when no one wanted to listen. Then she called Aaliyah's name. The room stood as she made her way forward. She wheeled herself onto the stage without help, every turn of her wheels deliberate and steady. She did not wear anything extravagant. No badge, no brand, just a charcoal blazer, a clean blouse, and the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. She took her place at the microphone. The room fell silent. "I wasn't supposed to be there that day," she began, her voice clear. "I wasn't on the list. I wasn't invited to give feedback. And when I spoke, no one listened." She paused. "They said I was just a kid, that I didn't know what I was talking about, that the professionals had it handled. But the professionals let something dangerous be built. The professionals signed things they didn't read. The professionals said it was safe, and it wasn't." She looked across the audience, engineers, architects, city leaders, students. "I didn't do what I did to be brave. I did it because it felt wrong, because if I had said nothing and something happened, I couldn't live with that." She looked down briefly, gathering herself. "I don't want to be famous. I don't want awards. I want people to stop pretending that everything is okay just because it's expensive or beautiful or signed off by someone with letters after their name. I want buildings to be safe. I want integrity to matter more than speed. And I want you to remember that sometimes the person you dismiss is the one who sees what you don't." Silence, then slowly applause, gentle at first, then growing. When she returned to her seat, the mayor rose. He didn't speak long. He said the city owed her more than gratitude. He said there would be changes. He said she had reminded them of the purpose behind every permit, every code, every regulation. Aaliyah watched his face carefully. She didn't fully trust him, but for the first time, she saw sincerity in his eyes. That night, as the city lights flickered beyond her bedroom window, Aaliyah sat quietly beside her father. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked. He took a long breath. "Some will, some won't, but they can't ignore it anymore." She nodded. "Then I want to keep going." He looked at her. "With architecture?" "With truth," she said. Weeks passed. The Future Built Center remained closed. A third-party firm was brought in to oversee repairs. The original leadership was formally investigated. The firm itself was restructured. But more than that, new legislation began circulating in City Council. Measures to increase transparency in material sourcing, to digitize inspection records, to ensure public access to safety data. The changes wouldn't fix everything, but they were a start. Aaliyah returned to her school, where most teachers treated her with newfound awe and careful formality. Her classmates watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disbelief. She didn't let it distract her. She kept studying. She kept building. She began designing again on her own time. Her father gave her his old drafting table, and she placed it in the corner of the living room like an altar. And then, one morning, she received an invitation. It came from the National Conference for Emerging Engineers and Designers. They had created a new youth forum, inspired by recent events. They wanted her to speak. Not because she was disabled, not because she was young, but because she had seen something that others had not, and had refused to look away. On the day of her talk, the hall was packed. Students, professors, professionals. Her name was printed on the program without a title. Just Aaliyah James. She rolled onto the stage to a quiet room, and she began, "I was 14 when I saw the crack, and the world listened." If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to see it.